his own growing up. And I just think there may be a different sort of experience in Canada. Like we went to, I remember I made friends at a Jain camp. Jainism is a religion, my father's religion. And there was a Jain camp, and I went to the white camps. I went to the YMCA camps also in the summer. But I went to a Jain camp, and it was a wonderful experience because, as I said, I grew up with mostly white friends. And there it was, I really didn't, not that I felt it so strongly, the color of my skin, but there it was just not an issue because everyone was the same skin color, and we all formed wonderful friendships. And then they would talk to me, the friends from the States who were at this Jain camp, they would come to Canada, and they'd say, there's something different here. Like, I just don't feel the color of my skin as much as in the United States. And then I'd go to the States, and I would feel it a little more. I would just feel the fact that race was more of an issue in the States than I did feel in Canada. And I see, Sarah's nodding and others. So I think, I just want to clarify, that I think that there may be a different sort of experience going on. I don't think the States is quite at where we are. And again, it could relate to policy and multiculturalism and other things, but they are more segregated.
But let me throw this out there. I'm from Saskatchewan originally, and oftentimes people say to me things like, whoa, must have been hard growing up brown in Saskatchewan, right? I mean, the States is a diverse place. Are we talking about, in your opinion, the States being this monolith that race and mixed unions and all this is treated the same everywhere? Are we talking about urban America versus rural America?
I just think the States generally, and I think, again, it's because of national policy, and I think it's, again, because of the way in which the media and the way in which mainstream society, I just don't think the States is as enlightened, frankly, on race issues. I really believe that there's, and it's because of our history and with Trudeau and and Trudeau, the whole multicultural, that wasn't just benign sort of, enlightened thinking necessarily. It was about accommodating the Ukrainians, right, and the large ethnic groups, and so it just sort of, I think, happened a bit by accident. But I do think there's a different thing going on in Canada where we don't feel it as much, and I can't articulate exactly why, but I'm just saying I just don't feel it as much in Canada as in the States.
We're going to talk about multiculturalism. Before we get to that further on in the conversation, Reiner, I want to get you to respond to what Ravi's saying there.
Good, because I was wanting to.
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'm not the person who's out to defend the United States, at all. I think we have some serious problems, politically, in all sorts of ways, particularly for our military aggressions. However, I think that the differences probably they're historical differences. The U.S. has a very, very strong, the history of slavery in the United States is strong and still defines race relations in the United States. Now, Canadians don't have that particular experience. Minelle's talking about colonialism. We don't really have a sort of colonial experience in the United States. Really, our history is a history of slavery and of aggression against Native Americans. So there are different dynamics. However, I think that just as in the case of Brazil and the sort of fallacy about the Brazilian racial paradise that was prevalent 50 years ago, I at least am not willing to say that Canadians are more enlightened in regard to race. I just think there's a different dynamic. I'm willing to bet that in both places it's much better to be a white male than to be a black female. So just because the black-white issue may not be as pronounced, or just because people may be talking about multiculturalism more in Canada than in the United States, doesn't mean that there isn't a racial hierarchy and that race isn't a major problem.
I think everyone's going to want to weigh in on this one. I'm going to go to Minelle and then to you, Sarah. Minelle, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Rainer's dead on. I think one of the biggest differences in terms of looking at the similarities and the divergent points is the reality of slavery and colonialism. I couldn't agree more with that. But I really want to bring an analogy that came out of the interviews that I did with women of mixed race, because one of them said fighting racism in the States is like punching a brick wall, but fighting it in Canada is like punching a marshmallow, always melts back to the same shape. And I think that's a really instructive kind of way of understanding multiraciality in the Canadian context, right? To think about how we like to live within the state of kind of denial that we live in a racist country. We did have slavery here. It just took on less obvious forms. And yet we also have this idea we really want to believe that we're an accommodating, open nation. So a lot of these women who I interviewed felt really pulled between these two perspectives. And I think we really need to take that into account when you look at the way in which women thought about the multicultural policy, because it's not as if they're reflecting on the policy and saying the policy has opened up spaces for them to experience less racism. They're still experiencing racism. What they want to see is a multicultural policy with teeth that actually makes some changes to understand the complex forms of racism that they experience in their day-to-day lives.
What would that look like? What do you mean by teeth?
Well, actually something that deals with racism within systemic racism, within organizations, right? So they don't want just people to say, well, I'm really open to thinking about these things and having this kind of idea that mixed race people are like the solution to all the world's racist problems, that we're all sitting around and singing Kumbaya and eating our saris, you know, having our samosas and wearing our saris or whatever, right? They want to actually see changes within institutions, because the reality is there are still institutional barriers for people of color in mainstream institutions, and that's the kind of changes that they'd like to see.
You know, I wanted to talk to some of this too, because part of the thing that I think we ignore is that we're talking about the United States and Canada as if there's no blend between the two of them, and I don't think that's right. I think that it's true that if you want to look at the original sin, you know, sorry I was raised as a Catholic, of the Americans, it is slavery. Our original sin in Canada is the way we treated our Aboriginal people, and we are going to play that one out for generations. But the truth is that there is a very porous border across here, and there are influences back and forth. So just let me tell you a story about my mother, who is white, as I said, Scottish and Polish background. When she used to sing in something called Sweet Adelines. It's a choral group, and they had barbershop quartets. And we grew up in, I would call it Red River, but in Winnipeg, Manitoba, right? Very French, very white, back in my old day, right? And this black woman from the United States came and auditioned for the Sweet Adelines choir, which was an entirely white choir. And my mother was on the board, and my mom said she was just a drop-dead amazing singer. So her vote was, oh, well, let's bring her in right away. And everybody else on the board said no, because she was black. And my mother said, well, why not let her in? And they said, well, because our rules say that, you know, you can't do that. And my mother said, well, let's change the rules. And they said, no, we can't do that. And my mother said, why? And they said, because we compete in the United States. And if we go to the United States and we compete in the United States and we bring a black woman in there, we won't be allowed in. And my mother said, well, then we should separate from them. But they wouldn't take that. She ended up quitting in prison. It was a big story back in the early 60s, right? But all I'm illustrating there is the fact that the influences from the United States and slavery in the United States cannot be entirely separated from what happens in Canada. And I also think that our multiracialism or our multiculturalism policy and the way we deal with Indians or Native Americans here, because we didn't play cowboys and Indians like they did in the States, which was a death sentence. We played a different game with smallpox blankets and everything. We're just quieter and more, we're stealth fighters in our way of killing Indians. But I think they both influenced each other, and I don't think we can separate them.
Sarah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say about the part about representation. I think it's really important, kind of what Minelle was saying, the systemic barriers. You know, people say, why don't people buy into multiculturalism or diversity at work? Well, it's kind of like saying, you know, how do you break the ceiling? Because the ceiling is still there. How do you break past that? So I think people will start buying in. I don't like the term buying in, but when they see people of color or, you know, becoming more of a majority in higher positions. And as for the census piece, I think that's a big part of categorizing people. When people are forced to categorize themselves, for example, in the States, people have to choose, you know, black, white, or whatever, and only until year 2000 did they say you can now pick, I don't know if it was mixed race or other, and you can imagine how people were forced to choose. They didn't have a choice. So I think that has, you know, like for example, Obama saying he's black, that could have been throughout his life, he was forced to say I'm black. So I can see why he might not say he's mixed race even though he is.
Okay, we're going to talk about Obama and categorization and census coming up, but you know, there's a question that keeps coming back in my head as we're having this conversation, and it's this. I'm a child of Indian parents. Clearly the color of my skin is not white. We're all having an open and frank discussion. Would it make a difference? Would you all feel less comfortable if I was a white man or three people sitting at this table were Caucasians? Or is this a conversation, I always wonder, is this a conversation we're only allowed to have amongst ourselves? Or is it okay for that white person not only to ask questions out of curiosity, but to weigh in with their opinions? Minelle, I want to ask you that.
Oh, well, no, of course. I mean, the whole point is to open up a dialogue about these issues.
White people don't feel comfortable doing it a lot of times.
I'm not sure if that's the case, though. I think a lot of people do feel comfortable. I mean, I think that for all of us in the room, we really feel okay and comfortable, with having the conversation. And it's not as if people ask me where I'm from and it's a white person, and if it comes from a place of genuine kind of curiosity, I'm totally happy to do that. It's only when people are saying, I need to know what your racial background is. What is your blood quantum? Are you 80% Indian or 15% Iranian? That's when I get a bit irate. But I think that we can have these conversations, and that's really the whole point of opening up this